42 white chairs, perfectly aligned on the manicured grass. 35 of them entirely, glaringly empty. The lake behind the altar shimmered under the afternoon sun, a picturesque, indifferent backdrop to a spectacularly quiet catastrophe. My name is Eliana Monroe. I was 28 that day, standing at the edge of my own wedding aisle, realizing that my entire bloodline had effectively ghosted me. Not my father, the man who spent a decade promising to walk me into my new life. Not my aunts, who had feigned enthusiasm over floral arrangements just weeks prior, and certainly not my mother, Martha. Martha, who had fastened the pearl buttons of my dress in the boutique, shedding a single picture-perfect tear. That very morning, she had called with the warmth of a corporate receptionist canceling a dental appointment. "We're going to your sister's instead, Eliana," she had said, her voice dripping with that unbearable, practical calm. "It's her 31st birthday. She's going through a phase. She needs us more." A 31st birthday, not a milestone, not a crisis, a birthday against a wedding. I stood there, knuckles turning white around my bouquet, listening to the suffocating silence of the garden. They hadn't forgotten the date. They hadn't missed a flight. They had simply surgically chosen to be anywhere else. I dragged my gaze across the immaculate rows. 7 people, 7 guests out of 42. I knew each face intimately because survival makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. My college roommate gripping her clutch, her eyes glassy with secondhand devastation. 2 of Daniel's co-workers shifting their weight, terrified to breathe too loudly. A sweet, bewildered couple I barely knew. And Mr. Halbrook, my elderly neighbor standing at the very back, watching me with a solemn, unwavering dignity my own father lacked. The silence of those 35 empty chairs didn't scream. It whispered, "You do not matter." I was still frozen when the crunch of gravel broke the stillness. Slow, deliberate. I turned, bracing for a pitying glance, but found only Mr. Halbrook. He was wearing a vintage, immaculately pressed suit. "A bride shouldn't walk alone," he said, his voice a gentle gravel. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered his arm. I stared at the space where my father was supposed to be. The space I had kept warm for him my entire life, shrinking myself to fit his expectations, begging for scraps of validation. In that singular heartbeat, something inside me, something soft and pliable, crystallized into ice. I didn't just take Mr. Halbrook's arm. I clung to it like a sword. Let go of the fantasy, I told myself. Embrace the brutal reality. We walked. With every step toward the altar, the phantom weight of my family's expectations fell away. The breeze off the lake whispered through the empty rows, but I no longer saw them as a humiliation. There was no crowd to mock me, only space. Glorious, unburdened space. I wasn't a victim being paraded before empty seats. I was shedding a skin. At the end of the aisle stood Daniel. He didn't flinch as I approached on a stranger's arm. There was no patronizing pity in his eyes, just a quiet, fierce certainty. He gave a fraction of a nod, an acknowledgement of the shift he could already see in my posture. He didn't ask if I was okay. We both knew I was finally, dangerously awake. The ceremony was stripped to its bones. No performative applause, no superficial tears from relatives who would gossip at the reception. Just raw, unfiltered truth echoing in the open air. I felt the 35 empty chairs behind me, but they were no longer a wound. They were my witnesses. When we turned to leave, I looked back at the white rose one final time. The emptiness hadn't changed, but the woman looking at it had. The tragedy wasn't that I had been abandoned on my wedding day. The tragedy was that it took me 28 years to see them for who they were. I was never their priority. And as I walked away, a new, sharp thrill settled in my chest. I would never let them be mine again. In my family, love wasn't an emotion. It was a measurable currency. And by my mother's calculations, I was a depreciating asset. The massacre of my wedding day didn't happen overnight. It was orchestrated in plain sight, hidden behind polite smiles and casual conversations. I just refused to read the ledger. My mother, Martha, operated on a strict policy of return on investment. She didn't play favorites, she played the odds, and the house always bet on my sister Vanessa. At 31, Vanessa was the undisputed golden child. She ran a high-end event management firm in Boston, catering to corporate titans and old money. Through her, my parents secured VIP passes to a world of velvet ropes and champagne clinking that they could never access on their own. Vanessa didn't just bring home success, she brought home status. And me? I built my career quietly. No galas, no name-dropping. In the Monroe household, if you weren't making noise, you didn't exist. I should have seen the end coming the afternoon I brought my wedding binder to the dining table. I had spent weeks agonizing over every detail, curating a day that finally felt entirely mine. I slid the meticulously tabbed folder toward my mother. She flipped through 3 pages. Her eyes glazed over. "It's nice," Martha said, her tone as dry as dust. "How much is this setting us back?" She didn't ask if I was happy. She didn't ask about the dress. Before I could even defend my budget, the front door opened. Vanessa walked in, casually mentioning a rooftop gala she was designing for a tech billionaire. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. My mother leaned forward, her eyes lighting up, suddenly brimming with questions, opinions, and boundless energy. I sat there in the shadow of my own wedding plans, watching my mother shower Vanessa with the exact validation I had been starved of my entire life. It was during this same period of manufactured invisibility that the trap was set. A few days later, my mother slid a thick stapled document across the kitchen island. She didn't sit down. She kept wiping the counter, a masterclass in feigned nonchalance. "Sign the last page, Eliana," she said casually. "Just a formality. Family property adjustments for the trust. Vanessa already signed hers. Let's keep things simple." Keep things simple. That was the magic phrase. I skimmed the legal jargon, my eyes scanning words I didn't fully grasp. But I trusted her. She was my mother. Why would she hand me a loaded gun and tell me it was a toy? I signed on the dotted line, desperate to be compliant, terrified of disrupting the fragile peace. Looking back, the ink on that page was the blood I'd bleed on my wedding day. Vanessa's role in all of this was flawless. On social media, she was the ultimate devoted sister, posting curated throwback photos with captions about family first. But behind the filters, we were strangers. When I finally announced my wedding date, Vanessa's reaction should have set off every alarm in my head. Vanessa always had an opinion. She micromanaged centerpieces, she critiqued lighting. But when I told her the date, she just stared at me for a beat too long, smiled a thin, tight smile, and said, "That should work." No questions, no unsolicited advice, total unnatural silence. I told myself she was just busy. I lied to myself because the truth was too ugly to hold. Her silence wasn't a lack of interest. It was the silence of someone who already knew I wasn't going to have a wedding at all. The first crack didn't come from my family. It came from a question that wasn't supposed to exist. About 4 weeks before the wedding, my aunt called me in the middle of the afternoon. Her voice light, almost casual, like she was asking about the weather. "So, are you planning to go to both? Or just your own?" she asked, and for a second I didn't understand what she meant. Both what? I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at the counter like the answer might be written there somewhere. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make everything feel slightly off. She filled in the silence before I could respond. "Vanessa's birthday event, honey. Same day as your wedding, right?" The words landed slowly, like they needed time to settle into something real. Same day. Same day. I repeated it in my head because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. My wedding date had been set for months. Everyone knew. I had sent invitations, confirmations, reminders. There was no space for confusion. And yet somehow, there it was, sitting right in front of me, undeniable. My sister had scheduled her birthday event on the exact same day. I called Vanessa immediately, not angry, not yet, just needing an explanation that would make everything fall back into place. She answered on the third ring, her tone bright, controlled, the same tone she used when she was handling clients. "Hey, what's up?" she said, as if nothing was wrong. I asked her directly, keeping my voice steady, asking about the date, about the overlap, about how that had happened. There was a brief pause, just long enough to register before she responded. "Yeah, I know it's the same day," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. But the venue availability was limited, and this was the only option that worked for everyone involved. It's kind of out of my hands. Out of her hands. Vanessa didn't believe in things being out of her hands. She controlled everything, from the smallest detail to the largest decision. Hearing her say that felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully explain. I reminded her that my wedding was that day, that people couldn't be in two places at once, that it wasn't just a minor conflict. She responded calmly, almost dismissively. "People will figure it out," she said. "Some can come to yours, some can come to mine. It's not that big of a deal." The conversation ended without resolution, without acknowledgement, without anything that resembled understanding. I started calling people after that, one by one, carefully, trying to understand what was happening. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each person I spoke to had already heard from Vanessa. Not casually, not in passing, but directly. Personal calls, tailored conversations, each one designed to secure their attendance. My mother had been told the event was critical for Vanessa's business, that important clients would be there, that missing it could damage relationships that the entire family depended on. My relatives had been told about the scale of the event, the importance of showing up, the potential opportunities tied to being present. Everyone had been given a reason. Everyone had been given a justification. When I spoke to my mom, I already knew what she was going to say. I could hear it in the way she answered the phone, in the slight hesitation before she spoke. "I know this is hard," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But Vanessa's event is important. It affects her company, and her company affects all of us." The sentence hung there, heavier than anything she could have said directly. It wasn't about preference, it was about priority. And I wasn't it. I asked her quietly if she understood what she was asking me to accept. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she shifted back to logic, to practicality, to the same language she had always used when emotions became inconvenient. Around that same time, I started hearing small things about Vanessa's company that didn't fit the image she presented. A delayed payment here, a client pushing back on terms there, whispers of a contract that hadn't gone through the way it was supposed to. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to, but enough to suggest that everything wasn't as stable as it seemed. It explained the urgency, the insistence, the need to control attendance at an event that suddenly felt like more than just a birthday celebration. It felt like something she needed to secure, not something she simply wanted. When the RSVPs started coming in, I didn't need to open them to know what they said. I could see it in the numbers. Declines, one after another, each one polite, each one carefully worded, each one avoiding the truth. No one said they were choosing her over me. They didn't have to. The absence said it for them. I sat at my desk one evening, the stack of responses in front of me, and realized that I had reached the point where asking again would change nothing. I could call, I could explain, I could remind them what this day meant, but it wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made. That was the moment something in me went quiet. Not broken, not defeated, just still. I stopped reaching out. I stopped trying to find the right words to make them understand. Because the truth was, they already understood. They just made a different choice. And once I saw that clearly, there was nothing left to argue with. That was the week I stopped asking. Not because I ran out of words, but because I finally understood that no version of those words would change anything. I had spent days replaying conversations in my head, thinking about what I could say differently, how I could explain it better, how I could make them see what this day meant to me. But clarity doesn't always lead to change. Sometimes it just reveals that change was never an option. I drafted one final message to my family and read it 3 times before sending it. It was simple, factual, stripped of anything emotional that could be dismissed or misunderstood. The date, the time, the location, directions to the venue, and at the end, one line that felt heavier than everything else combined. I hope to see you there. I didn't ask. I didn't explain. I didn't remind them of what they already knew. I pressed send and waited, not with hope, but with a quiet expectation of what would come next. Hours passed, then a full day, not a single reply, no acknowledgement, no confirmation, nothing. Silence, clean and complete, like the answer had already been agreed upon before I ever sent the message. My mom called the next evening. Her tone was calm, steady, almost gentle in a way that felt carefully measured. "I've been thinking," she said, as if this was a discussion that still had room for adjustment. Maybe it would make more sense to move the date. Just a few weeks. It would be easier for everyone. Easier for everyone. I repeated the words in my head because they didn't include me. I told her quietly that everything had already been set, that deposits had been paid, that invitations had been sent. She acknowledged it, but only as an inconvenience, not a reason. "Sometimes things don't work out the way we plan," she said. "You have to be flexible." I realized then that flexibility, in my family, only moved in one direction. I didn't argue with her. That surprised me more than anything else. There was a time when I would have tried to convince her, to explain why this mattered, to remind her that this wasn't just an event, it was my wedding. But I didn't say any of that. I simply told her that I wasn't changing the date. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not long, but enough to signal that something had shifted. "All right," she said finally, her voice neutral again. "We'll do what we can." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even an attempt at reassurance. It was a placeholder, something to end the conversation without committing to anything real. Later that night, I sat on the floor of the living room with Daniel, the wedding plans spread out around us, the details I had once been so excited about now feeling strangely distant. He didn't ask me what happened. He already knew. He had been watching everything unfold from the beginning, not interfering, not pushing, just present in a way that didn't demand anything from me. "You don't have to do this the way they expect," he said quietly, not looking at me, his attention on a piece of paper in his hands. It wasn't advice. It was permission. Permission to stop trying. I asked him, almost without thinking, if he was worried about how all of this would turn out. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that didn't need explanation. "Things are about to change," he said, his tone calm, certain. "Just not in the way they think." I didn't press him for details. I had learned enough to recognize when something was being held back for a reason. Whatever he was working on, whatever was coming next, it didn't need to be explained yet. It was enough to know that he believed in it. And somehow, that belief steadied me more than any answer could have. At the same time, I could feel the pressure building on the other side, even without being directly involved in it. Vanessa's event was getting closer, and from what I could gather, it was becoming more than just a celebration. There were expectations tied to it, people who needed to be impressed, outcomes that needed to be secured. I heard it in the way my mom spoke, in the careful way she chose her words, in the emphasis she placed on how important everything was for Vanessa. It wasn't just about showing up. It was about maintaining something that couldn't afford to break. I started to see my own role in all of this more clearly, not as someone they had intentionally hurt, but as someone they had already adjusted around. I had always been the one who adapted, who made things easier, who understood when priorities shifted. This time, they expected the same. They expected me to move, to change, to make space for something they believed mattered more. And for most of my life, I would have. But not this time. The days leading up to the wedding were quieter than I expected. There were no last-minute changes, no frantic calls, no dramatic confrontations. Just preparation, steady and controlled, each detail falling into place exactly as I had planned it. The flowers arrived on schedule. The venue confirmed everything without issue. My dress hung in the closet, untouched, waiting. Everything was ready. Everything except the part that was never going to be there. The night before the wedding, I stood alone in the bedroom, looking at everything laid out in front of me, the final version of a day I had imagined for years. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel excited. I felt clear. Clear in a way that left no room for doubt or second-guessing. Tomorrow wasn't going to bring answers. It was going to confirm what I already knew. By then, there would be nothing left to question. The morning of my wedding began in complete silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels deliberate, like the world was waiting to see if I would break first. I woke up before my alarm, staring at the ceiling for a few seconds before everything came back at once. Today. This was the day I had planned for months, the day that was supposed to bring everything together. For a brief moment, a small, quiet part of me wondered if someone might still show up, if something might change at the last minute. I reached for my phone without thinking, as if the answer might already be there. It rang before I could even unlock it. My mom's name appeared on the screen, steady and familiar, like nothing had changed. I answered, not because I expected something different, but because I needed to hear it said out loud. Her voice was calm, measured, almost careful. "Eliana," she said, "I wanted to call you early so you wouldn't be surprised later." There was a pause, just long enough to prepare me for what was coming. "With the timing of Vanessa's event and the travel, we won't be able to make it to the ceremony." She didn't sound apologetic. She sounded practical, like she was explaining a scheduling conflict, not missing her daughter's wedding. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the words settle. "Dad?" I asked quietly, even though I already knew the answer. Another pause. "He's here with me," she said. "We're both staying." That was it. No explanation, no attempt to soften it, no acknowledgement of what had been promised. My father, who had told me he would walk me down the aisle, wasn't coming. The promise didn't even deserve its own sentence. It disappeared inside her decision like it had never mattered in the first place. I waited for something else, anything that sounded like hesitation, like doubt, like regret. There was nothing. "I understand," I said, and I meant it in a way she would never fully grasp. Not understanding as acceptance, but understanding as clarity. I ended the call before she could add anything else, before the conversation could turn into something I didn't need. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment differently. I thought there would be anger or sadness or at least some kind of reaction that matched the weight of what had just happened. But there wasn't. There was just a quiet certainty that nothing was going to change. When I arrived at the venue, the garden looked exactly the way I had imagined it. The chairs were arranged perfectly, white against the green grass, the lake stretching out behind them like a painted backdrop. Everything was in place, every detail exactly as I had planned it. For a moment, it almost felt normal, like the day could still unfold the way it was supposed to. Then I noticed the empty seats. Not gradually, not one by one, but all at once. The absence wasn't subtle. It was complete. 42 chairs and only 7 people standing among them. I recognized each of them immediately, not because they stood out, but because there were so few. My best friend gave me a small, steady smile, her eyes already shining with something she was trying to hold back. 2 of Daniel's co-workers nodded politely, their presence quiet but intentional. A couple I barely knew stood near the back, as if unsure where they belonged but unwilling to leave. And then there was Mr. Halbrook, standing a little apart from the others, his expression calm, grounded, as if he had already accepted the reality of the moment before I had. For a second, I let myself feel it. Not the pain, not the anger, but the weight of what this actually meant. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad timing. This was a choice, repeated over and over until it became something permanent. I had been given a place in my own family, and today they had shown me exactly where it was. I was still standing at the edge of the aisle when Mr. Halbrook stepped forward. "You shouldn't walk alone," he said simply, offering his arm. There was no hesitation in his voice, no question about whether I would accept. He had already decided to be there in a way no one else had. I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood something I hadn't before. Presence isn't about obligation, it's about choice. And he had chosen to stand with me when the people who were supposed to had not. I took his arm, and together we began to walk. The sound of our steps was soft against the ground, almost lost in the open space around us. I didn't look at the empty chairs again. I didn't need to. I had already seen them. I focused on the end of the aisle, on Daniel standing there, waiting. When our eyes met, there was no question, no uncertainty, just a quiet, steady understanding that this moment still belonged to us, no matter who had chosen not to be part of it. The ceremony was brief, simple, stripped down to its most honest form. There was no audience to impress, no expectations to meet, no need to perform anything for anyone else. When I spoke my vows, my voice didn't shake. It carried clearly, steady, and certain, as if the absence behind me had cleared the space for something real to exist in front of me. This wasn't the wedding I had imagined, but it wasn't less. It was something else entirely. When it was over, I turned slightly, almost without thinking, and looked back at the rows of chairs one last time. They were still empty. That hadn't changed, but the way I saw them had. They no longer felt like something I had lost. They felt like something I had finally understood. That was the moment I stopped waiting for them to choose me. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need them to. 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of waves instead of silence. The light in Santorini was different from anything I had ever seen, soft and golden, stretching across the water as if the entire horizon had been painted just for that moment. I stood barefoot on the balcony, the air warm against my skin, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything going right, but the kind that comes when nothing is pulling at you anymore. Daniel was still asleep inside, the room quiet behind me, untouched by anything that had happened. There were no expectations here, no conversations waiting to happen, no decisions to defend. Just the sound of the ocean and the steady rhythm of a life that didn't need to explain itself to anyone. I realized then how much of my life had been shaped by anticipation, by waiting for reactions, by adjusting myself around other people's choices. Standing there, I felt that weight fall away in a way I didn't even know I needed. It wasn't planned. The photo, I mean. It happened the way most real moments do, without intention, without strategy. Daniel stepped out onto the balcony behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders, pulling me slightly back against him. The sun was lower now, the light warmer, softer, turning everything gold. I picked up my phone without thinking, turning just enough to capture the moment. The ocean behind us, the sky open and endless, the two of us standing there without anything else in the frame. No family, no expectations, no history attached to it. Just us. I stared at the photo for a few seconds after taking it. It didn't need editing. It didn't need explanation. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. When I posted it, I kept the caption simple, starting where peace begins. No tags, no location, no context. I didn't post it for them. I didn't post it for anyone. I posted it because, for the first time, I wanted a record of something that belonged entirely to me. The reaction came faster than I expected. Within minutes, my phone began to vibrate. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just a few notifications, nothing urgent. But it didn't stop. The vibrations came one after another, stacking, overlapping, building into something that felt almost unreal. When I finally picked up my phone, the screen was filled with missed calls and messages, more than I could process at once. Over 200 notifications in less than an hour. My mother's name appeared repeatedly at the top. Call after call, message after message. "Are you okay? Where are you? Why didn't you tell us?" The tone was urgent, almost panicked, as if she had suddenly realized something she couldn't control anymore. My sister's messages were different. Short, direct, searching for information rather than connection. What is this? Where are you staying? Since when is Daniel doing this well? And then there were the others. Aunts, cousins, relatives who hadn't sent a single message on my wedding day, now suddenly eager to reach out, to congratulate, to reconnect, to act as if nothing had happened. I scrolled through them slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. It was almost clinical, the way I read each message, noting the shift in tone, the sudden interest, the careful wording. Not one of them mentioned the wedding. Not one of them acknowledged what they had chosen just 3 days earlier. Their attention wasn't about me. It was about what they thought I had become. I set the phone down without replying. The silence I had been given on my wedding day had taught me something important. Attention, when it arrives too late, doesn't carry the same meaning. It doesn't fix what has already been revealed. For the first time, I realized that I didn't owe them a response just because they had decided to finally speak. Daniel stepped beside me, glancing at the screen before looking back at me. "You don't have to answer," he said, his voice calm, steady, like he already knew what I was thinking. I nodded slightly. He was right. I didn't have to explain anything. I didn't have to justify where we were or how we got here. What we had built wasn't something that needed to be presented for approval. They didn't know the full picture. They didn't know about the months Daniel had spent quietly working, about the investors he had met, about the platform he had built piece by piece without announcing it to anyone. They didn't know about the funding already secured, the deals already in motion, the future that was already unfolding whether they were part of it or not. And for the first time, I understood the power of that silence. Real change doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, and by the time people notice, it's already too late to question it. Hours passed before I picked up my phone again. The messages had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. I opened the family group chat, reading through the sudden flood of conversation that hadn't existed just days before. For a moment, I considered ignoring it completely, letting them sit in their own uncertainty the way they had left me in mine. But then I typed a single message. "Thank you for reaching out. Daniel and I are doing well." I paused, then added one more line. "The choices we make matter." Then I sent it and put my phone away again. I didn't wait for replies. I didn't need to see them. Instead, I stepped back onto the balcony, looking out at the horizon as the light began to fade. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of me, quiet, steady, unchanged by anything happening behind me. For the first time, their silence didn't define me, and neither did their attention. By the time we returned home, everything had already begun to shift in ways no one could undo. The noise from those messages hadn't stopped, but it had changed. It wasn't urgency anymore. It was curiosity, calculation, and something quieter beneath it that felt a lot like uncertainty. I didn't rush to answer any of it. I moved through my days normally, letting things unfold without stepping in, watching the pieces rearrange themselves without my involvement. Daniel's work didn't stay quiet for long. Within a couple of weeks, the platform he had been building was officially announced. It wasn't loud or exaggerated, but it was real. The kind of announcement that doesn't need attention to matter. Investors confirmed their backing, industry publications picked it up, and suddenly his name began appearing in places my family actually paid attention to. The numbers spoke for themselves. The valuation climbed quickly, crossing into a range that made people take notice whether they understood the details or not. It wasn't just success, it was legitimacy, and in my family, legitimacy was everything. I saw the moment it reached them, not directly, not through a conversation, but through the way their messages changed. My mom's tone softened, shifting from questions to concern, from concern to something that almost resembled careful interest. She asked how I was doing, how Daniel was doing, what our plans were now. The questions were different, but the pattern was familiar. It wasn't about connection. It was about recalculating where I fit into the picture they understood. Vanessa's situation began to surface around the same time. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with small mentions, things that could have been dismissed if you weren't paying attention. A postponed event, a client stepping back, a contract that didn't go through as expected. Then more followed. A major partnership that had been central to her company's growth quietly disappeared. The kind of partnership that doesn't leave without taking something with it. I didn't need confirmation to understand what it meant. I had seen enough to recognize instability when it began to show. One evening, I pulled out the document my mother had asked me to sign months earlier. I hadn't thought about it since, not really. At the time, it had seemed insignificant, something administrative, something that didn't require my attention. But now, reading it again, I understood it differently. It wasn't meaningless. It never had been. There were clauses tied to shared assets, to decisions that required agreement, to structures that assumed cooperation. It didn't give me control, not directly, but it gave me something I hadn't realized I had. Leverage, quiet, unspoken, but real. My mom called a few days later. Her voice was different this time, softer, more measured, less certain of where she stood. She didn't mention the past. She didn't bring up the wedding. Instead, she asked if we could meet, if we could have dinner, if we could talk. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them had shifted. This wasn't an invitation extended from a place of authority. It was a request. Vanessa reached out the next day. The message was short, direct, without the usual layers of control. "We should talk." That was it. No explanation, no framing, no attempt to manage how it sounded. When I called her back, her voice was steady, but I could hear something beneath it. Pressure. Not panic, not yet, but the kind that builds when things stop going according to plan. She didn't ask directly for help. She circled around it, mentioning how complicated things had become, how difficult the situation was, how much responsibility she was carrying. It was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging vulnerability. I listened without interrupting. I didn't rush to respond. When I did speak, my voice was calm, even, the way I had learned to keep it when emotions weren't useful. "I'm not part of those decisions anymore," I said. There was a pause on the other end, longer than usual, heavier. She tried to shift the conversation, to bring it back to something familiar, something that placed us back in the roles we had always occupied. But those roles didn't fit anymore. Not for me. "I'm not saying no," I added, because I meant it. "But I'm not saying yes just because you expect me to." The difference was subtle, but it mattered. For the first time, I wasn't responding based on what they needed. I was responding based on what I chose. After that call, I sat quietly for a while, letting the silence settle the way it had before, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not final, just clear. I thought about everything that had happened, how quickly things had shifted, how easily the roles had reversed without any direct action from me. I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't forced anything to change. I had simply stopped adjusting myself to fit into something that no longer worked. That was enough. I looked out the window, watching the late afternoon light settle across the street, steady and unchanged. Somewhere else, things were still unraveling, still shifting, still being questioned. But here, in this moment, there was nothing left to prove. They were finally beginning to understand something I had learned weeks ago. What it feels like to be optional. Time didn't fix anything. It revealed what was real and what had only ever existed because I kept holding it together. Months passed, not in dramatic shifts, but in quiet adjustments that slowly reshaped everything. The noise faded, the urgency disappeared, and what remained was something far more honest than anything that had come before. Life didn't go back to the way it was. It moved forward into something new, something that didn't depend on whether anyone chose me or not. Vanessa's world changed first. The signs that had once been subtle became impossible to ignore. Her company didn't collapse overnight, but it shrank, contract by contract, event by event, until the version of success she had built her identity around no longer looked the same. The large-scale events became smaller, the clients less exclusive, the constant stream of visibility replaced by long stretches of silence. On social media, the curated perfection gave way to occasional updates that felt less certain, less controlled. The confidence was still there on the surface, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. My parents felt it too, even if they never said it directly. The stability they had relied on shifted beneath them, and for the first time, there was no clear direction to follow. The conversations that once revolved around Vanessa's achievements became quieter, less defined. I could hear it in my mom's voice when she called, in the way she spoke more carefully, as if she was no longer sure which words would lead to the outcomes she wanted. She didn't ask for anything anymore. She didn't suggest, didn't advise, didn't position herself as the one making decisions. She simply reached out. The first time we met again, it wasn't planned in the way it used to be. No expectations, no roles assigned before we even sat down. Just a conversation that felt unfamiliar because it didn't follow the patterns we had always relied on. She didn't apologize directly, not in the way I might have expected months ago. But she listened, really listened. And for the first time, that felt more real than any apology she could have offered. Vanessa reached out too, though it took longer. When she did, it wasn't through a carefully constructed message or a controlled conversation. It was simple, almost hesitant. We met in a quiet place, away from anything that could be used as a stage. She didn't try to explain everything. She didn't defend her choices the way she always had before. Instead, she said something I hadn't expected. "I thought if your life worked out better than mine, I wouldn't matter anymore." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even a full apology, but it was honest in a way I had never heard from her before. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't try to fix what she said or soften it into something easier to accept. I let it sit between us, the way truth does when it doesn't need to be shaped into something else. "I never needed you to lose for me to matter," I said finally, my voice steady, not sharp, not forgiving, just clear. She nodded, looking down for a moment, as if she was still learning how to exist in a space where control didn't define everything. I didn't go back to the way things were. That was never an option. But I didn't cut them off completely either. What I did instead was something I had never done before. I chose the terms. I decided how much I would give, how much I would share, how much I would allow. Not out of punishment, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Relationships don't survive on obligation. They survive on respect. And for the first time, that respect wasn't something I was trying to earn. It was something I required. Life with Daniel settled into something steady, something real. Our days weren't defined by what anyone else thought of them. His work continued to grow, not in a way that needed constant attention, but in a way that built quietly, consistently. My own path became clearer too, shaped by choices that didn't have to be explained or justified. We built something that didn't depend on being seen, something that existed whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Sometimes, I think back to that day in the garden, the 42 chairs, the 7 people who stayed. For a long time, I thought that moment would always feel like something I had lost. But now, it feels like something I gained. Clarity, distance, the understanding that absence can be a kind of truth you can't ignore once you've seen it. What mattered in the end wasn't who left, it was who stayed. And more importantly, it was the moment I stopped measuring my worth by the people who didn't choose me. If you've ever been in a place where you felt like you had to prove your value to people who should have seen it already, I want to ask you something. Would you have answered those calls? Would you have explained yourself? Or would you have stayed silent and let your life speak for you? If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts. I read every comment and I want to know what you would have done. And if you're still here, still listening, there are more stories like this waiting for you. Stay with me and subscribe if you want to hear the next one when it comes. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.